So I was working on an Evelyn video and I was going to talk about her disk drives. It's no secret that she doesn't really have a great disk drive set right now, but one of the sets that's recommended is Hormone Punk. I was going to use unreliable as a word to describe this set, but if you read it, there's nothing unreliable about it. It gives a buff for 10 seconds and has 20 seconds of downtime. That's very specific and it does exactly what it says. Unreliable would be giving a random buff or having a variable uptime. So why did that description come to mind? Hormone Punk, among most other buffs in this game, don't feel obvious, because while it's an extremely powerful buff, there's no actual indication that you have it. The buff is often around the value of a Lucy buff, which also has the same duration if you don't use the whole version, but there's a key difference. I can tell when Lucy's buff is active because if I want to look, it's right there. However, if I want to know if my Hormone Punk buff is active, I have to pause, go into my detailed stats, and check if the bonus attack value matches what I'm expecting. And if I wasn't paying full attention, I have no way of knowing exactly when it will expire. So instead of making an informed decision on whether to do something that's quicker but less damage to fit within the buff window, or a longer animation that's more damage because I know I have enough time, I'm just guessing. Yes, obviously you could just mentally use the timer and add 30 seconds from each activation so you know exactly when it's active next, but I could have also said that about Lucy's buff. If I got rid of the buff indicator, I could just say just add 10 seconds to the timer. Imagine playing Lucy and having to do that every time to know if her buff was up. Yeah, it could just be a skill issue, but it's also something that I don't think has to be a skill issue. There's already a lot happening on the screen at any given moment that I don't think that this is something else that the average player should be expected to do. The timer is out of the way from what's happening on the screen for a good reason. And yeah, maybe Hormone Punk could just be the skill issue disk drive set, but that doesn't have to be the case. Like I showed in the thumbnail, we could just have these buff effects up there with every other combat buff that we get. And it's not just Hormone Punk that would benefit from this. Literally every disk drive set provides a buff and has a condition to provide that buff. Okay, not everyone, these three are technically a debuff to the enemy, and Shockstar Disco isn't really an active buff that would be on the buff sheet, but the point still stands. The elemental ones are just conditional on activating an anomaly, but even the wording between them varies. Some of them are active while the enemy is suffering from an anomaly, while others require you to hit an enemy from suffering from an anomaly, and the Ether set has stacks. And now, aside from Hormone Punk, let's talk about the two disk drive sets that would benefit from this the most, Woodpecker and Astral Voice. It's not very obvious how Astral Voice works, and it's also not easy to mentally track if you use the Quick Assist once every 15 seconds and how many stacks you have. I also think that if you could see the stacks, you would notice how impactful it actually is because it's really powerful, but only if you're using it properly. And Woodpecker is that one set that looks like it's alright, but you'd still rather use anything else if you have the option. It has a short duration and a lot of characters won't use all three parts. However, even still, wouldn't it be useful to know how many stacks are active at any given time? If you're using the Woodpecker set, it would be so easy to just drop a basic attack and hope it crits before ulting so you get that 9% extra combat attack bonus if it isn't active already. Or you can make an informed decision to use a dodge counter instead of an X special iframe to get that third stack. This isn't just about disk drive sets. Lots of W engines also have really useful effects that would be really helpful to know. For example, Starlight Engine. It's a really good W engine, but when I was trying to get a sub 1 clear with what should be your best team, spoiler, it actually wasn't the strongest in these runs, what I noticed was that I'd often lose a lot of uptime on the buff because I was parrying so often to generate as many decibels as possible. It's generally a really easy buff to have up and maintain, but it's also really easy to forget about it. Also right now, without testing it manually, can you tell me whether or not Evelyn's skill dodge activates Starlight Engine? There's also lots of other W engines where having this information on the buff screen would be extremely useful. Weeping Gemini, for example. It's got a really long description. Let me ask, when was the last time you actively thought about how many stacks of it that you have? If you answered recently, good for you, but I bet the majority of players just kinda use it because a guide maker or Pridewind recommended it, but it actually requires you to be active in stacking it up, and 192 anomaly proficiency is a lot. It would hurt absolutely no one for people to know that they've got an additional 192 anomaly proficiency because they fully stacked the buff, or that the stun expired, so it's now gone. Last, there's also support W engines. Lucy's in particular would be a really useful one to have information on. Each member of your team has to hit once every 8 seconds, but again, you usually aren't thinking about that. Sure, if you're missing a stack or two, it's not the biggest deal in the world, but this is information that can affect how you play. If you see only 1 or 2 stacks, you can actively make the decision to swap to the last character to get another stack. So Kaku's is also another decent example. If I know that the buff is about to expire, I can swap to my support and use another skill so that the effect doesn't drop. I'm also probably forgetting some notable signature W engines with some useful buff effects too, and some of them probably could even change the way you play the character. It's also not even just done at disk drive sets and W engines. Did you know that Bang Boos are apparently now buffers too? This Snap guy apparently gives a 10% damage bonus with his skill, but I've genuinely never noticed him give it. Man, it would suck to know when that little guy is actually helping, for once. Okay, you can tell when he gives a buff because Bang Boos do usually do some dialogue whenever they're doing their skill, but again, there's no reason that this information has to be hidden. I would like to know when that buff is active so I can actually play around it if I choose to. It just has to be a small circle under the HP bar, and it conveys so much useful information, so why hasn't Hoyo added this in? I'll give a few main reasons why I think they haven't done so. The first is visual clutter. Let's be honest, looking at the buffs can sometimes be confusing, especially when you don't know what each buff means, and I bet that the majority of the player base has no idea what any of the current buffs look like. And then there's so many potential buffs that could be there. Your DPS disk drive set can potentially have one, then there's Astral Voice, and then maybe in the future there's another disk drive set that provides another buff. Then, let's say your W engine is giving you a buff, and you have two supports whose W engines are also giving you buffs. Finally, your Bang Boo is also giving a buff, so I'm asking for 7 more little circles to show up on the UI. Then there are up to 3 separate debuffs that you could inflict on an enemy, although I can't really think of any team composition that would use all 3 at the moment, but the point still stands. That definitely sounds like it would make the UI really messy. I can acknowledge that it might be true, but I already acknowledge that most of the player base probably doesn't use this information, so there's no reason for them to see it. There could be a little tab in the options menu to display additional combat information, or display advanced combat information, or whatever you'd like to call it, and then you get an extra row of information below the already existing buffs. Yeah, it might look messy, but at least the players who know what to do with the information will have it, rather than it being much more complicated to get it. The option could even just be off by default, and most of the player base will never have to see it. Now I'll go into the more sinister reason why I think this information isn't being displayed. I think Hoyo actually doesn't want you to have this buff information because it goes against their monetization plan. They don't want you to know the buffs your builds are providing, because that would cause your team to perform better. They'd rather you run into a problem, and rather than saying, oh, my Starlight engine buff wasn't active, or oh, I didn't stack Astral Voice, you go, well, I guess I have to pull their signature W engine, and if that's not enough, yeah, maybe I need this M1, so on and so forth. If I'm right that this is why we don't have this information readily available, well, I guess it's a quality of life feature that we'll never get. I guess we can throw in disk drive presets in there as well. Going back to the beginning, with Hormone Punk being the skill issue disk drive set, it would be useful to have that as a preset for when you do want to run into a skill issue, and then for when you don't feel like having a skill issue, you can swap to like a Woodpecker set or any other set. You know, another game just added them. Hoyo can never? Maybe I'm making too much of a big deal out of it, and I really only made this video because of a slight inconvenience to myself. But I do think this is a feature that would help everyone. So if you want this quality of life feature added to the game, subscribe. Well, those two aren't related at all, but I just made them related. Or you could let Hoyo know that this would be a useful thing to have in the next survey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Yes, it's kind of crazy that Lighter wasn't in the fastest clear, but I guess Nicole Astra is just that strong. I didn't even change my pen ratio 5 disc for that clear, so it would do even better with fire damage on disc 5. If there's something I could do to drop the Lighter's team's clear time, let me know, but I'm kinda shocked that this was faster.